Hi everyone, my name is Megan, and we're running a really fun study right after class about mindfulness and vision. It shouldn't take more than 10 to 15 minutes, so if you're interested, we need more than 60 people, so just come up to the front after class, and it won't take a long time. It's really fun. Thank you.
Now there's a story about Gertrude Stein, and she was taking a philosophy class with William James right here in the yard, and they had their final exam, and it was a spring semester course, and she comes into the exam, and it's a day like today, and the exam is about metaphysics and the meaning of life. So she opens the exam and writes, "Today is too beautiful a day to take an exam," and she walks out. And as legend has it, of course, she gets a straight A in William James's class. Don't use that as an example or as an excuse later on in the semester. But I really appreciate you being here today. It is a beautiful day. I was thinking of having the class outside, but I think maybe we should, yeah. What we're going to do today is finish up on relationships. We have just a little to go, and then start with our final topic for the course, which is self-esteem. So let me just recap what we did when we discussed relationships. So we talked about how do we, given our natures, how do we sustain lasting love, lasting passion, when it seems, on a physiological level at least, that our natures are not attuned to that approach. And we talked about, when studying the best relationships, the tip of the stem, 4 characteristics based on the work of David Schnark and John Gottman. The first one is relationship is hard work. It's an illusion to think that the most important thing is finding the right relationship. It is more important to cultivate that one chosen relationship. And just like we would not thrive, succeed at work if we said, well, I just found my dream job, and then put our legs up and relax, similarly, we would not thrive in a relationship if we have the finding mindset. We just need to find it, and then we'll live happily ever after. As we talked about, movies end where love begins. The second component of a healthy, lasting, and passionate relationship, related to the first one, is the notion of being known rather than being validated. Expressing rather than impressing. Being open, revealing our weaknesses as well as our strengths, our desires, our passions, our fears and insecurities. And relationships that do that, or partners that do that within a relationship, over time attain higher and higher levels of intimacy, happiness, and they thrive, and they maintain their passion. That's the second component. The third component of a healthy relationship is that there are conflicts there. It is an illusion to believe that the ideal relationship is one that is conflict-free. That doesn't exist unless both partners are suppressing serious issues. So there are conflicts in relationship. The challenge is to have more positivity than negativity, of course, in the relationship, and also to learn how to be in the midst of disagreement, how to have conflict. And finally, the fourth point that we talked about was positive perception. Being a benefit finder, and more than that, being a benefit creator. I want to just go back quickly and elaborate on something that I didn't last time about the conflict, or conflicts within a relationship. I think the most important article that I read about relationships in general was the article on friendship by Ralph Waldo Emerson, published in 1841. And what Emerson writes about is his ideal friend. Let me quote him. He says, "In a friend, what I'm looking for is not a mush of concessions, a person who will agree with everything that I say. Rather, what I'm looking for is a beautiful enemy, a person who will challenge me, who will push me, who will help me in my apprenticeship to the truth. A beautiful enemy. What a beautiful phrase. A conflict-free relationship is where there are no beautiful enemies. A beautiful enemy is a person who loves us, who cares about us enough to challenge us, enough to disagree. And ask yourself, what kind of friend, what kind of romantic partner would you like? A yes man or woman? Or a person who will be honest, who will have high levels of integrity? What is the ideal friend? What is the ideal partner? You know, it's interesting, this whole idea of a beautiful enemy goes way back. And it goes back to one of the, if not the most influential text in certainly the Western world, which is the Bible. In Genesis, God sees that man is alone, so he creates a helpmeet for him. A woman. A helpmeet. What does that phrase mean? This is the King James translation. Well, if you look at it in the Hebrew original, helpmeet is ezer kenegdo, or help as opposition. In other words, the helpmeet translation, the meet part, M-E-E-T, is like an athletic meet, like a competition. Not helping and they meet together. It's help as opposition. And already then it was noticed that the ideal relationship is not one which is all smooth, conflict-free. It is one where there is some resistance. And it's this resistance that Gottman talked about is talking about in the 21st century that is so important, so critical for a healthy relationship. A beautiful enemy. Help as opposition. Help meet. Again, with a lot of positivity in the relationship as well. So let me move on and just finish up on positive perception. I want to show you an excerpt from one of my favorite movies, I think one of the best movies, certainly in the realm of psychology, ever made, from As Good as It Gets. And here is the part where Holly Hunter tells Jack Nicholson that he better give her a compliment, and it better be a good compliment, because if it is not, she's getting up and leaving. He had just said something very offensive to her. So here is what he has to say to the woman he loves. This is the essence of benefit creating. You make me want to be a better man, a better woman, a better person. You make me want to do the dishes as well. What do we do then? How do we get a relationship or partners in a relationship to focus on the positive, to focus on the benefit, to focus on creating more good there? Well, we're going back to the very first lesson, very first class, and that is the importance of questions. Remember, questions begin a quest. When we ask a certain question, we see certain things that we didn't see before. When we ask a certain question, we're also avoiding or not seeing part of reality. Remember the geometric shapes. It's all you saw. You didn't see colors. You didn't see children on the bus. Most of you did not see the clock. And very often in relationships, the questions that we ask after the honeymoon is, what's wrong? What happened? Or what can be improved? And again, these are important questions with very good intentions, but we just avoid or don't see an important part of reality. So the questions that we need to ask are also the positive questions, questions that will allow us to see the children on the bus. What am I grateful for in my partner? And it's important to do that always, especially during difficult times, because there's always something to appreciate. And if we don't appreciate that thing, the good depreciates. Whether it's applying to our country, to our organization, to our relationship, as well as to ourselves. Second positive question, what is wonderful about our relationships? What's working? Why are we together in the first place? What do I love about him, her, us? What's good? And when we ask what's good, that's when we perceive it. And when we perceive it, when we appreciate it, it appreciates. It's not a surprise that the statistics are as they are, what we saw last time, that most relationships flounder, and even those that stay together don't really thrive. No, it's no coincidence. It's because most of the questions that we ask, again with good intentions, no one has the intention, certainly not going into a relationship, to end it or not to thrive in it. But most of the questions that we ask, that we are taught to ask, are the ones that focus us on the metaphorical geometric shapes. And what we need to do is open up a new quest, new opportunities, see things that are there all along, that we simply have overlooked. Again, the quote from Robert M. Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So often, we look for the truth, and then the truth comes and knocks on our door, and we say to it, go away, I'm looking for the truth. Very often, it's right in front of us. All we need to do is look, and one way to look, one way to guide our attention toward what is right in front of us is by asking also the positive questions. Okay, so what do we have? What do we have so far? In terms of creating a more positive relationship, in terms of being a benefit creator, we want to focus on the potential. But there's one more thing that we can do, and that is communicating about positive events. This is taken from the work of Shelley Gable from UCLA, who's done, to my mind, the most important work in the area of positive psychology as it relates to relationships. You see, there's a lot of research that has been done on negative communication, meaning what we saw last time. How do you disagree? So rather have a cognitive disagreement rather than an affective or emotional disagreement. Focus on the substance, focus on the behavior rather than on the person, on the emotions. So we know that there is a lot of research in organizational behavior, in couples counseling research, and so on. There has been almost no research done on positive communication between couples, which is in line with most of the research done in psychology. Again, remember the ratio 21-1. Now it's a little bit less, but around 20-1 ratio, positive to negative research. Same when it comes to relationship, no exception, unfortunately. Here comes Shelley Gable and says, well, we also need to focus on what is working. And she started to study positive communication about positive events. And lo and behold, what she found was quite remarkable. In fact, what she found was that the way couples communicate about positive events is a better predictor of long-term success in relationships than how they communicate about negative events. When things go well, better predictor of long-term thriving, passionate relationship than when things do not go well. So when I come home and tell my partner, oh, I just did this and it was amazing, or I've just seen this and it was breathtaking, or this is what's going on at work, this is what's going on in my personal life, and it's a good thing, how my partner responds predicts our long-term success of the relationship. Specifically, what Gable is talking about is active, constructive responding. What is active, constructive responding? What she does is divide it into a 2x2, and I'm going to present the 2x2 now. This is taken directly from the work of three of my colleagues, Jen Elsner, Barbara Hellman, and Amanda Horn from Australia. And here is what they did. Put Shelley Gable's work into an understandable, clear 2x2. So we have on the one dimension constructive versus destructive communication. On the other dimension, active versus passive communication. Let's go through the 4 boxes using an example. My partner comes home from work and she says, I just got a promotion. The promotion that I've been waiting for so long. I was just told that I got it. How do I respond? Well, if I'm passive and destructive, I show no interest, divert attention, I say, and just move on or talk about, but did you see we got a new flower in the garden? Just talk about something unrelated to it. Divert attention. This is passive and destructive. Now, destructive and active. Just got a promotion. She comes home and my response is, oh no, this means we'll even have less time to spend together. What does this mean about our children now? Or what about our holiday that we were going to go on next month? It's not possible now, is it? Destructive and active. Then there is passive constructive. This is the most common response. Oh, that's great, wonderful. Wow. And then there is the 4th box, the active and constructive, which is, you were just, that is amazing. Tell me all about it. So what happened? Did the boss call you into his office and tell you how did it happen? Or we have to celebrate. Or let's call our friends and go out. This is amazing. Well done. You've worked so hard for it. I'm so happy for you. Active, constructive. As it turns out, there are consequences, ramifications to each one of these responses. Unfortunately, the active and constructive, not very common. Not very common among partners, especially after the honeymoon phase. So when initially the physiological, the novelty, excitement is there, that happens more often. But after a while, this goes away, and with it, as Shelley Gables has shown, the success of the relationship in the long term. Now, the thing about active constructive responding is that it applies to numerous areas in our lives, not just to romantic relationships. How I communicate with my roommates, how I communicate with my family, parents, children. As a therapist, how I communicate with my clients. Because again, most of what psychology has been about is for the therapist to sit there and to be passive constructive. To smile, wonderful, and then what happened? As opposed to active constructive, and there are consequences. It doesn't mean it's the right approach in every relationship every time, because there are a few constraints here. For example, it has to be win-win events. Let's say my partner comes from work and says, Tal, you won't believe it. I just made the most amazing love with my colleague. He was unbelievable. In fact, I'd never felt this way before. Now, active constructive, do tell more. And what happened then? Very difficult to be actively constructive in this situation for most people, present company included. Very difficult. So it's about win-win. That's not a win-win as far as I can see. It has to be a win-win. In other words, something that both of us, or the relationship, will benefit from, or at the very least, that the other person is not hurt by it. It has to be genuine. It cannot be fake. Because that comes through, especially once the partner knows you. Over time, it just doesn't work. It has to be genuine, meaning we have to get into the role of our partner, identify with, empathize with, be one with, so that we can genuinely respond to it. And if we do genuinely respond to it, and if it is a win-win event, that's when it generates upward spiral on a few levels. First of all, remember, usually when a positive event happens, what happens? There is a spike up and then effective forecasting, Gilbert's work shows, goes back down again. What effective constructive responding does, which is, okay, tell me more. So how was it? Let's celebrate. Give me more details. I want to know. I'm interested. What it does to that spike is prolong it. It actually keeps it going for much longer than it would have had it just been a positive event and then back to base level. Because we know no matter what promotion we get at work, initially it feels great. No matter what raise, initially it feels wonderful, and then it goes back down again to base level. Active constructive responding actually elongates that raise, that improvement in well-being. So that's one spiral that it creates, feeling better. The second spiral is an interpersonal spiral, meaning a person who actively constructively responds genuinely enters the same upward spiral, meaning people who do that genuinely become happier as a result of it because they experience the event and they themselves benefit and become happier. Again, a win-win potentially. And finally, it also does what positive psychology as a whole does, which is build positive capacity. Remember, positive psychology takes us not just from the zero to the positive, it also helps us better deal with the negative to the zero. Partners who actively, constructively respond to one another are building capacity for hard times. In fact, one of the most interesting researches that were done a long time ago was that couples where things went well, where that language wasn't used, but essentially where they actively, constructively responded to one another and supported one another back in the 1920s. Once the Great Depression hit, the relationship actually became better. Whereas partners who didn't have it good before, the relationship very often dissolved, became worse. In other words, when they built the capacity, it helped them also deal with hard times, such as 1929 and the 1930s. There are no shortcuts when it comes to good relationships, to healthy relationships. It is hard work if we want to succeed, just like it is in every other domain in life. There are no shortcuts. However, that doesn't mean that the hard work cannot be enjoyable, cannot be pleasurable, as well as meaningful. And when that hard work is pleasurable and meaningful, over time, that leads to a happier relationship, happier individuals, to a win-win togetherness. I want to end by just addressing a point that many of you have raised with me. And that is, should we even talk about relationships in the context of the pursuit of happiness? And the answer for most people is yes, with some discomfort. Yes, because it's the number one generator of the ultimate currency. Some discomfort because pursuing happiness is, by its nature, selfish. I mean, after all, when I'm thinking about my happiness, I'm thinking, by definition, about the self. And shouldn't a relationship be about the opposite of selfishness? In other words, about altruism. So let me say just a few words about this. Let's take an example from teaching. Imagine this. Imagine that I actually don't like teaching. I don't like to teach. I don't like coming here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And in fact, it's very painful for me. However, I have a deep sense of duty because of my upbringing, because of the philosophies that I read. I have a deep sense of duty to other people. And I know that positive psychology is or has some important messages to give people, and therefore I teach it. Not because I like it, but because I think it can potentially help other people. And I wake up on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings and I dread going to class. The hour and a half seems like eternity to me. The last thing in the world I want to do is teach, but I'm driven by my sense of duty because I'm an altruist. I'm sacrificing myself for what I think is a greater good. Now think of the alternative. Imagine this teacher, and then imagine the alternative. And the alternative is me. I love teaching. There is nowhere else I would rather be right now than here. I love positive psychology. I can't wait to get into my computer and write the lectures. I can't wait to prepare the PowerPoints and work hard on Google Image to do so. I can hardly wait to interact with you. I love being here every Tuesday and Thursday. It is my passion. It is my calling. It is both pleasurable and meaningful to me to spend time with you. And now I ask you, which teacher would you rather have? The teacher who is here out of a sense of duty, for altruistic reasons, or the person who is here for selfish reasons, because he would rather be here more than any other place. I also ask you, which teacher do you think would be a better teacher? And now I ask you, which partner would you rather have? A partner who is with you just because they feel like, well, that person really needs me, or I feel sorry for the person. I don't really like that person, but I'm there just to be there for them, because out of a sense of duty. Or would you rather have a person who is with you because you're the most important person in their lives, because they care about so much that the I becomes a we. They care about you as much as they care about themselves. They include you in their circle of the self. Which relationship do you think will thrive more? Now, that does not mean that there is no sacrifice in relationships. That does not mean that if my partner is unwell or needs my help, I will not go out of my way, even if it means giving up some things that I really, really want to do at that point. Of course, in healthy relationships, when the I becomes the we, sacrifice exists, and there is healthy sacrifice. But it's not a relationship that is based fundamentally on a sense of duty or altruistic negation of the self. As Nathaniel Branden says, the more independent we are, the more interdependent we can become. That's when the I becomes a we. Again, this is something which goes against much of our teachings. It's not always easy to accept. But again, this class, much more than it is about positive psychology, is about reality psychology. And ask yourself, what partner would you rather be? What partner would you rather have? What teacher would you rather have? Completely analogous. Okay, let's move on now to the very last topic of this class. As I've said many times, I never procrastinate. I just use Google Image. I started to think explicitly about the topic of self-esteem when I was a senior as an undergraduate here. I started to think about it when I noticed another phenomenon. So that was after I'd switched into philosophy and psychology. I was very happy in my concentration. I was very happy in playing on the squash team. Harvard was going great for me. But then I started to notice something that was unclear, didn't make sense to me. And that was the fact that I had low self-esteem. Or so it seemed at least. And it didn't make sense to me. Because I was doing well, I had won prizes, I'd received a lot of accolades, a lot of support, whether it's from my roommates, friends, family, a lot of pats on the back, in athletics, in academics, and yet I had low self-esteem, and it just didn't make sense to me. And there was another thing that baffled me even more. It was as if, on some level, I was punished by success. What do I mean by that? Every time when I would succeed, or when I did get praise, my self-esteem would increase, would improve. But then, very quickly afterwards, it went down back to its base level and even lower. And in order to raise it back up again, I needed even more praise, even more accolades than I needed before. And the metaphor that kept on coming to mind was Sisyphus pushing a rock up a mountain. I would push that rock up the mountain, struggle, till the next victory came. And the next victory came, and I got the praise, I got the accolades, I got the prize. And my self-esteem was high. I was on top of the mountain. And then this rock would be rolled down again. And I would have to run down and start pushing it up again, only this time the hill was even steeper. And I would have to struggle even more. And I would get up there again, and then it rolled back down. Now it wasn't enough to have the accolade, the praise, the amount, the quality, and the quantity that I had before. I needed even more just to get onto the same mountain, even steeper, even more difficult. And it didn't make sense to me. And then I took a class. Senior year, ended up being one of my favorite classes for various reasons which I will not go into now. Fairy tales. I took fairy tales and we read Emile, Rousseau's Emile, and Maria Tatar talked about wonderful theories, and it clicked. I ended up writing my senior thesis, my final paper for that class on self-esteem, and that eventually became my dissertation. That's what I actually wrote my PhD on, this topic. So what I want to do today is share with you some of the insights that I got in fairy tales, as well as other thinkers who have been thinking about this topic of self-esteem, because it is important. It is not for nothing that I end the course with the topic of self-esteem, because it is at the foundation, at the core of so many of the other things that we discussed, whether it's healthy relationships, whether it's happiness in general, whether it's benefit finding or benefit creating, whether it's being known rather than validated. Self-esteem encompasses so many of these ideas. So here is what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to talk about why it is important. A lot of misunderstanding about what self-esteem is and is not. We're going to talk about some theories that can apply to our lives. Then we'll elaborate on the paradox that I just talked about, that sometimes success actually leads to lower levels of self-esteem. And why does that happen? We'll explain that. And then I'll introduce essentially my dissertation on self-esteem, where I divided the one construct into three distinct components, which are dependent self-esteem, self-esteem that is generated by others, praise, approval; independent self-esteem, self-esteem that comes from within, self-esteem that is not contingent on what other people say, self-generated; and finally, unconditional self-esteem, or a state of being where we simply and naturally exist. So I'll talk about these three levels and how we can cultivate independent as well as unconditional self-esteem. And finally, we'll end next time by talking about how we can enhance our levels of self-esteem. Now, many people, when they listen to a lecture on self-esteem, go into evaluation mode and say, okay, so do I have high self-esteem? I meaning you. Or is my self-esteem higher than the person sitting next to me, or my partner or friend? And the answer to this question is, you can't really know. I mean, we can't measure self-esteem, quote-unquote, objectively. We don't really know where it is in the brain yet. We may be able to 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But that's not an important question. Just like, am I happy or not, is not an important question. In fact, a misleading question. The question, rather, remember, is how can I become happier? The same with self-esteem. The question is not do I have high or low self-esteem, but rather how can I enhance my self-esteem? Because as I'll argue shortly, there cannot be too much self-esteem. But sometimes people associate with too much self-esteem, which is arrogance and conceit and narcissism, is not self-esteem. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's lack thereof. So having a stronger sense of self is a good thing. And the question is, how can I enhance it? Today my self-esteem is higher than it was when I started thinking about it 15 years ago, and hopefully 15 years or 5 years from now it will be higher than it is today. It is a lifelong process, and we'll talk about how that lifelong process unfolds and what we can do to expedite it, to intensify it. So first of all, definition of self-esteem. There are numerous definitions. Let me read you just a few from the main thinkers in the area. So Albert Bandura, Stanford professor, explains gauging self-esteem, quote, in terms of how people evaluate themselves. Those who express the sense of unworthiness are said to have low self-esteem, whereas persons who express self-pride are said to hold themselves in high esteem. Another well-known thinker in the area, Germain, defines self-esteem as the judgment and feelings about the self. Very simply, the judgment and feelings about the self. Cooper Smith, one of the most important thinkers in the area, self-esteem is an evaluation which an individual makes and customarily maintains with regard to himself. It expresses an attitude of approval or disapproval and indicates the extent to which the individual believes himself to be capable, significant, successful, and worthy. Capable, significant, successful, and worthy. In short, self-esteem is a personal judgment of worthiness that is expressed in the attitudes the individual holds toward himself. It's about the attitude that I have toward myself. It's the evaluative part of the self-concept. The definition that I will use, that I used in my dissertation, and I think that captures best what self-esteem is about, is Nathaniel Branden's. Nathaniel Branden, considered by many to be the father of the self-esteem movement in this country, if not the world, a therapist and a philosopher that has been working in the area for 50 years, defines self-esteem as following. The disposition to experience oneself as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and as worthy of happiness. Two components, the feeling, the experience of competence, and the feeling and the experience of worthiness. Both are important. If we lack one, we very often have low self-esteem. Personal example, I felt very competent at what I was doing, whether it was on the squash court, whether it was in relationships, whether it was academically. And yet my self-esteem was low because I didn't have the worthiness component, now I know, of self-esteem. So one or the other are not enough. We need both. Nathaniel Branden continues, of all the judgments we pass in our lives, none is as important as the one we pass on ourselves. Why? Because we're constantly with ourselves. It affects every area of our lives, when we're alone, when we're with others, when we're at work, when we're working by ourselves, when we're in a team. It affects every area of our life. As Goethe said, the greatest evil that can befall man is that he should come to think ill of himself. So high self-esteem is important, or self-esteem, a sense of self, is important. And yet, if we look around us, if we look within us, there is much room for improvement. Some people more than others, but for everyone, there is room for improvement. Here are some of the benefits associated with high self-esteem. First of all, mental health, higher levels of resilience, dealing with difficulties, and this applies to kids who are 6 years old or to 96-year-olds. Throughout our lives, the higher our levels of self-esteem, the more resilient we are, the better we're able to deal with anxiety, with depression, with the inevitable hardships that arise. Relationships improve. This applies very much, as we'll see later, to romantic relationships. It applies as much to friendships. It applies as much to family relationships. In the words of Brandon, self-concept is destiny. Beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think of myself, believe in myself, believe that I'm worthy, that I'm capable of a lot, I'm much more likely to succeed. Remember the two predictors John Cotter had for highly successful HBS grads. The first one was that they were always asking questions, always wanting to learn more. The second was that they believed in themselves. This is what distinguished the most successful from the rest. Self-concept is destiny. Emotional intelligence, a concept popularized by Daniel Goleman, initially introduced by Salovey from Yale, by Gardner from Harvard. How effective we are with others. Our intrapersonal intelligence, our interpersonal intelligence, together making emotional intelligence much higher for people with high levels of self-esteem. And finally, the sum total happiness. In my research, as well as other people's research, the correlation between self-esteem and happiness is above 0.6. Very high correlation. Not the only determinant, but certainly one of the major determinants of happiness. On the other hand, low self-esteem is associated with anxiety. I'm not talking about the natural kind of anxiety. If I'm standing on a cliff and I feel some anxiety looking down, that's natural, that's healthy. Permission to be human. It's important to experience anxiety. It's natural. We all do it. Just like the law of gravity is part of physical nature, anxiety is part of human nature. But anxiety that is unhealthy is one that is for no apparent reason. Again, Brandon calls it self-esteem anxiety. Suddenly waking up in the middle of the night and feeling anxiety for no apparent reason. Or going through life generally with a sense of angst or fear. Not really clear, not really sure of what. That is very often a symptom of low self-esteem. Depression. Again, we're constantly spending time with ourselves. We're constantly inside our minds. The I is constantly evaluating the me. And if the evaluation is wanting, if it's low, very often it leads to depression. Psychosomatic symptoms include insomnia, include getting sick because our immune system is lower, physical immune system is lower, and so on. Self-concept is destiny. It applies to our top performance, it applies to our worst performances as well. School children who are underachievers, very often that's associated or a result of low self-esteem. Nathaniel Brandon calls self-esteem the immune system of consciousness. The immune system of consciousness. When we have high self-esteem, it means we're more resilient psychologically. Remember, a strong immune system does not mean we don't get sick. It means we get sick, but less often, and when we do get sick, we recover more promptly. The immune system of consciousness. It means that sickness is the exception, well-being is the rule. It means that we're pursuing happiness rather than constantly running away from unhappiness. These are all signs of high self-esteem versus low self-esteem. Resilient psychology. Bednar and Peterson, two researchers in the area, asked the question, what is the underlying cause, or is there an underlying cause to most psychological disorders and ailments? And what they came up was with one construct, and that was self-esteem. Self-esteem is critical, first of all, in understanding many of the emotional and behavioral problems, and second, in terms of treating most, not all, but most of the emotional and behavioral problems. Self-esteem at the core. Finally, it doesn't just apply on the individual level, it also applies on the societal level. There was a California task force by the government that coined self-esteem as a social vaccine, because what they found was that self-esteem was associated, low self-esteem was associated with substance abuse, teen pregnancy, school dropout rates, violence, and crime. And high self-esteem did the opposite, helped overcome these social ailments. Again, not a panacea, but helps in many ways. So self-esteem is good. Self-esteem, in fact, is great. It's important. However, not all is rosy in self-esteem land. And there are some criticisms, and some criticisms by very important thinkers in the area. One of them, the leading one, is Roy Baumeister from Florida, equating self-esteem with arrogance and conceit. Because if you take a questionnaire of narcissism, those who are high on narcissism will also score very high on a self-esteem measure. But here lies the problem. And here in the paper that you're reading is how we can debunk at least this criticism. There are others. You see, a person who is a narcissist, who is arrogant, doesn't have high self-esteem. I mean, we all know that's common sense. Someone who walks into the room immediately looking like a peacock, showing off, bragging. Does that person have high self-esteem? Probably not. A person who is humble, who doesn't need to constantly show off, is usually the person with higher levels of self-esteem. As Rollo May, one of the founders of the humanistic psychology movement, says, the person who feels weak becomes a bully, the inferior person a braggart. A flexing of muscles, much talk, cockiness, and endeavor to brazen it out are symptoms of covert anxiety in a person or a group. It's the exact opposite of self-esteem. Unfortunately, today, our measures of self-esteem are through questionnaires. And if you ask a narcissist, do you have high self-esteem? The answer will, of course, be yes. However, most of the questionnaires are not sophisticated enough today to differentiate between true self-esteem and what Nathaniel Brennan called pseudo-self-esteem, the pretense of self-efficacy and self-respect. Soon, we'll be able to measure that much more objectively. So that's for narcissism, but there are other criticisms, and that is that self-esteem, high self-esteem, leads to unrealistic evaluation, and that ultimately hurts people. Let me read you something from Times Magazine, a report about a certain test that was given to kids, 13-year-olds, in different countries around the world. A standardized math test was given to 13-year-olds in 6 countries last year. Koreans did the best, Americans did the worst, coming behind Spain, Ireland, and Canada. Now the bad news. Besides being shown triangles and equations, the kids were shown the statement, quote, "I'm good at mathematics," unquote. Americans were number 1 with an impressive 68% in agreement. American students may not know their math, but they have evidently absorbed the lessons of the newly fashionable self-esteem curriculum, wherein kids are taught to feel good about themselves. Where kids are taught to feel good about themselves, and I will add, no matter what. Because many teachers have learned to just give indiscriminate praise. Why? Because self-esteem is good, it's a social vaccine, and there's a lot of research to back that up. And how do you enhance self-esteem? By showering people with, oh, you're terrific, you're wonderful, you're great. But that, it turns out, does not help these students. In fact, in the long run, in the short term, it feels good, but in the long term, it actually reduces their motivation to work. It makes them unrealistic, and in the long run, it makes them less happy than they potentially could have been. In fact, it boomerangs. Again, with good intentions, because they want to raise their self-esteem. So how do we salvage self-esteem? By understanding its true nature. First of all, self-esteem is not a product of empty reinforcement. Oh, you're wonderful, you're terrific, you're great, no matter what. That hurts self-esteem in the long term. Self-esteem has to be distinguished from pseudo-self-esteem. Once again, the pretense of self-efficacy and self-respect without the reality. That's not self-esteem. That's narcissism. That's detachment from reality. And as we've been talking about constantly, psychological health is a function of connection to reality. So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is founded in reality, in actual performance, in actual success, in actual practices. It is the product of hard work. Okay, do you remember the secret of success from 2 months ago? Optimism, belief in oneself, passion for what one is doing, and finally, hard work. That's the secret. Again, something we all know, something that is commonsensical. But again, common sense, in Voltaire's words, is not that common. Nathaniel Branden talks about 6 practices that are important for the cultivation of self-esteem. First, integrity. That's your response paper this week. To raise levels of awareness about integrity. And integrity means a match between what we say and what we do. The little things and the big things. Whether it's, I'll be there at 5 minutes after 5, being there at 5 minutes after 5. Saying that I'm going to work out this week and actually doing it. Because you see, when we communicate, when we utter words, and we don't follow up on what we say, what we're essentially communicating to ourselves, what I say is not important. It doesn't matter. Whereas when I maintain high levels of integrity, when I keep my words, and again, no one is perfect, no one has perfect integrity, as we'll talk about next time, but when I generally keep my word, when I follow up on what I say, when I under-promise and over-deliver, that's when I communicate to myself in action. Remember, self-perception theory. In action, I communicate to myself, my words matter, I matter. So the practice of integrity, the practice of self-awareness, know thyself. Self-consciousness, as Branden talks about. Purposefulness, having goals, having self-concordant goals, pursuing them. Living a life of purpose, of calling. Taking responsibility. Remember, once again, no one is coming. It's up to you to make something of your life. The practice of self-acceptance, permission to be human on a daily basis. And finally, the practice of self-assertiveness. To say no when it's appropriate, to say yes when that is appropriate. To stand up for what we believe in. These are the practices that over time cultivate self-esteem. And they're also a product of self-esteem. As we'll see next time, it's a potential self-reinforcing loop. So this is what self-esteem is. But there are more problems. There are more problems in self-esteem land. Here is another important criticism. You see, a lot of research shows that people with high self-esteem are more generous and more benevolent toward others. They're generally good. They're nice. A lot of research shows that. So that's wonderful, terrific. However, there is also a lot of research that shows the exact opposite. That people with high self-esteem display antisocial behavior, whether it's toward people they don't know, especially toward people close to them. It's been associated with aggressive and uncooperative behavior. Levels of hostility associated with high self-esteem in some studies. There are contradictory evidence. Doesn't make sense. What's going on in self-esteem land? Hasn't been resolved until recently. Another criticism of self-esteem is what I mentioned, the paradox of self-esteem. You see, the praise that I received as a senior here, or as a student here in general, was praise that was based on reality. You know, I did well in squash, I got praise for that. I did well academically, I got praise for that. So it was real, it was grounded in reality, and yet I still felt like I had low self-esteem. In fact, the more praise I got, in many ways I felt that the rock became heavier and the mountain steeper. And that is not explained by traditional self-esteem research. Bednar and Pedersen talk about this paradox, and they give examples in their book. And this is the first place where I found someone talking about something that I'd experienced for many years. They talk about the paradox where very often success is associated with low levels of self-esteem. So let me read to you an account of a client that they had. They're a therapist who has been very successful. And here he is writing in his journal. For the past several years, I felt that my life was meaningless. This was an ironic state of affairs, considering all that I'd accomplished. Friends and relatives were always lauding me for my good looks and intelligence. I was the first person on either side of my family to graduate from college, doing so with honors. I had a good job with an important accounting firm. I had plenty of dates. By all outward appearances, my life was very fulfilling. Yet I was miserable and felt increasingly depressed. 6 months of psychotherapy had helped me to catch an occasional glimpse of the underlying cause of my unhappiness. It always seemed to involve low self-esteem or my disapproval of myself. Somehow it seemed like I really did have a low opinion of myself, but I found that idea confusing because of all the success in my life. Bednar and Pedersen talk about or introduce there the paradox of self-esteem. That's what they call it. Self-esteem is not associated with success. It's not associated with social status, with money. It's associated with other elements. In fact, as the paradox shows, very often more success leads to more difficulty in this realm. It was this difficulty that I wanted to explore and explored in my research. And this is the formulation that I introduced. The first level of self-esteem was a dependent self, because what I felt was that self-esteem as a construct was not enough. The contradictions there were plenty. The paradox there was not explained by the notion of self-esteem. So I divided self-esteem into 3 parts based on the work of Lovinger. She did her work back in the 60s, based on the work of Maslow, based on the work of Carl Rogers and Nathaniel Branden, who had talked about these things. But again, we're not in the majority. Most people who talked about self-esteem talked about it as a single construct. The second component, self-esteem that is not contingent on others. And finally, the third component, essentially, does not even need to be called self-esteem, simply a sense of self. Let me begin with each one, describing each one. And what I'll do in describing each one is talk about the 2 components of self-esteem. So essentially what I'll create is a 3x2. The 3 types of self-esteem, each one how it relates to worthiness, to self-respect, and how it relates to competence, the 2 components of Nathaniel Branden's work. So first of all, in terms of worthiness. In terms of worthiness, a person who has high dependent self-esteem is other-determined. They enjoy and they need the appraisal. If I do well in a lecture and I get external feedback, that makes me feel great. If I don't get great feedback, I feel awful. If I do well on an exam and I get good feedback from my TF or parents, I feel terrific. If someone tells me that they don't like something that I said, I feel awful. My life is constantly affected by what other people think or say, or what I think that they think, or what I think that they mean. Constant evaluation. What do other people think of me? Like a looking glass, looking at other people as it reflects on me, and taking their evaluation as the sense of self that I have. People who have high dependent self-esteem are primarily, not only, but primarily motivated by what other people think and say. I will choose a job that will yield the most prestige, the highest social status, that will yield the most accolades and praise. I will choose a partner where I think most other people will approve of and like. Again, the sense of self contingent on other people. The important decisions are made based on other people's approval or disapproval. Second, sense of competence. The second component of self-esteem, according to Brandon, comes through other comparison. How am I doing relative to other people? If I do better than others on a test, I feel great. If others do better than I do, no matter how objectively good or bad it is, what matters is how I'm doing relative to others. William James captured this. He said, I, who have staked my all in psychology, am mortified when others know more psychology than I, compared to other people. In fact, most psychologists have talked about self-esteem as dependent self-esteem. The work of Cooley, talking about the looking glass metaphor. The work of Mead back in 1934, talking about dependent self-esteem. How we valued ourselves depends on what others say or think, or what we perceive they think or say about us. Most of the thinkers have talked about it. This is best captured, and this is where I thought about it for the first time, in fairy tales. This is best captured by the evil queen. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And as long as the mirror says, you, my queen, are the fairest of them all, she feels great. As soon as there is one person who is more fair than thee, immediately she's mortified. The two components of self-esteem here. First of all, other-determined. I'm asking a mirror to evaluate me, not self-determined. So my worthiness comes from an external source. And second, competence. I compare myself to others. Is there anyone who is fairer than I? Dependent self-esteem. Now, I've quite literally now caricatured dependent self-esteem. So let me make it this very clear. Everyone has some dependent self-esteem. There is no person that I've met or have heard of who is oblivious to what other people think or say, or to social comparisons. It's part of human nature. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. If we fight it, it will only intensify, as we've seen numerous examples throughout the semester. Permission to be human, and part of being human is that we all have some dependent self-esteem. The question is of degree. The important thing to understand about this model, the three levels, is that it's an epigenetic model. It is an epigenetic model. And I have no idea what that means. No. Epigenetic is that you first need to get past the first stage in order to get to the second stage. You first need to get past the second stage in order to get to the third stage. That you cannot skip, for example, from stage 1 to stage 3 without going through 2. So everyone experiences dependent self-esteem, always. However, after a time, if we have healthy dependence, which is natural, which we all have at an earlier age, later on it becomes independent. And if we're able to cultivate healthy, independent self-esteem, we go up to the unconditional self-esteem, to the state of interdependence, which is the highest level. But even at that highest level, we still have remnants, and we'll always have elements of the dependent as well as the independent sense of self. When I started doing my research, initially, I depicted independent versus dependent, I hadn't thought of unconditional at the time, as independent good, dependent bad. And I tried to get rid of the dependent self. And what happened, it just simply intensified. It simply got stronger. And I became even more dependent. Whereas as soon as I started to accept it, remember, I talked about it, permission to be human. As soon as I accepted it as part of human nature, it actually lost much of its power over me. Still there, as it is for everyone. But the question is of a degree. The second level, self-esteem, independent self-esteem. As its name suggests, that's self-esteem that's not contingent on other people. So in terms of worthiness, I evaluate myself according to my own standards. I'm self-determined. I determine how good a book that I wrote is. Ultimately, the ultimate arbiter. I do take into consideration and listen to what other people are saying, but at the end of the day, I'm the one who decides. Competence, not comparison to others, but comparison to oneself. Have I improved? Am I a better writer today than I was in the past? Do I know more math today than I knew at the beginning of the semester? Am I able to apply more things from positive psychology than I applied initially? Not compared to my roommate who's applying so much more or so much less, but mostly focused on the self. Once again, people who wrote about this type of self-esteem: Nathaniel Branden, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and a handful of others. A person who has dependent self-esteem looks for constant approval, is afraid of criticism. Very often it's associated with perfectionism. Whereas a person who has an independent sense of self looks for criticism. In fact, that person constantly looks for beautiful enemies, people who will challenge him or her, who will help them in their apprenticeship to the truth, because they want to improve. Their motivation, their primary motivation is, what am I passionate about? What do I care about? What do I really, really want to do with my life? They're about pursuing self-concordant goals. A friend of mine, Mike Moldavano, philosopher, writes about dependent self-esteem. And he says that this person answers or is associated with the following. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. Many people with dependent self-esteem say, yes, I'm really pursuing what is right, what is true, what is noble. Whereas actually the motivation is protecting the self from criticism, from negative evaluation, from a lower sense of self-esteem that is contingent on others. And once again, in contrast to saying we want the truth, meaning we want to be correct, we have the person with independent self-esteem who wants beautiful enemies, who really is an apprentice to the truth. To summarize, initially the first 2 by 2, dependent self-esteem, worthiness determined by others. I do things for accolades, for praise primarily. And competence, how well am I doing relative to other people? Am I better or worse than them? And that determines my self-esteem. In terms of my worthiness, in terms of independent self-esteem, I compare myself to myself. Have I improved? Am I getting better? Am I learning? And my worthiness is determined by my own evaluation. Third level, unconditional self-esteem. In many ways, this is not even self-esteem because there is no esteeming involved here. The first component, worthiness, not contingent. It's not contingent on other people's evaluations. It's not even contingent on my evaluation. I'm confident enough not to be engaged in evaluations. In terms of competence, it's interdependent. I don't compare myself to how well I'm doing relative to others, nor even to how well I'm doing relative to myself. I'm in a state of being, interdependence with others, fully comfortable in my own skin. For example, a person writing a book who has high dependent self-esteem is primarily motivated by the accolades, by the praise that he or she will get. A person who has high dependent and also by how well that book is doing relative to other books. A person with independent self-esteem writes a book and derives pleasure and satisfaction from writing better than he or she did in the past, from improving, as well as from self-evaluation of the book. This is good. A person who has unconditional self-esteem simply writes a book. Why? Because he or she wants, if they have a good idea, a good book to be out there. They derive as much satisfaction, as much pleasure when they see another person's book who is good. They're interdependent. They see themselves as one with others. Once again, everyone has some components of dependence, some components of independence, and some component of unconditional self-esteem. The question is of degree. The model is epigenetic. It takes a lifetime very often to cultivate more and more of the unconditional self. Now, one of the criticisms that I face and other writers who have written about unconditional self-esteem is that to be at this stage of where I don't really care or don't care that much about whether I get criticism or evaluation is that one becomes detached from others, that one does not care. But that is not the case. You see, there are many parallels between unconditional self-esteem and the Buddhist conception of detachment. Let me read to you something that was written by the Buddhist nun Thupten Chodron, and I quote, "Ordinarily, we become very upset when we are criticized or insulted. We're angry when our possessions are stolen. We're jealous if someone else gets the promotion we wanted. We're proud of our looks or our athletic ability. By contrast, when we reach this state of detachment, our mind becomes clearer and more capable of enjoying things for what they are. We live more in the present, appreciating things as they are now, without fantasies about what they are or will be. We become less ego-sensitive to every action other people do in relation to us." Now, at the same time, detachment or unconditional self-esteem, which is the parallel that I'm drawing, does not mean being indifferent or rejecting other people's feelings. She continues, "On the contrary, when we're not attached, our relationships with others are harmonious, and in fact, we care more about them. We become more compassionate, more empathic toward others." Detachment or unconditional self-esteem simply means that we are distancing ourselves or not experiencing as much feelings of jealousy, feelings of envy, constant superiority or inferiority, ongoing comparison to others. It means, on many levels, that we are one with them. This is what the research shows. In fact, you can think about unconditional self-esteem as parallel to going to a movie. When you go to a movie, what happens? You're empathizing with the characters there. When they go through a hard time, you experience a hard time viscerally. When they thrive and succeed, you thrive and succeed. You're one with them. Why? Because your ego is not threatened. You're not threatened by their success. Their good looks are not threatening to you. Their successes are not a threat to you. Why? Because it's just a movie. Now imagine if we could have these emotions, feeling with as opposed to against. Imagine if we can have these emotions in real life. How much more powerful would they be? This is the experience, again, of a movie, but so much more powerful because it's real, of a person who has high levels of unconditional self-esteem. Cultivating self-esteem, unconditional self-esteem, takes time. It's a lifelong process. In many ways, it's parallel to learning how to walk. What happens when we learn how to walk? Initially, we can't. After a while, we're able to get up, but we need some help. We're dependent on a chair, on our parents to hold us, dependent on other people. Next level, after a while, is independent. We're able to walk by ourselves. But we walk still by thinking about picking up this foot, and we're precarious, we're uncertain, but we're independent. Later on, we simply and naturally walk. We don't need to think about it constantly. When it comes to a sense of self, initially there is no sense of self when we're born. After a while, the sense of self is dependent on other people, other people's evaluation. Then, after a while, we become independent of what other people say, or we try to assert our independence, but we're constantly evaluating ourselves, constantly comparing ourselves. And then finally, after a while, when we cultivate this strong sense of independence, we simply and naturally exist. That is, if nature is allowed to take its course, and that takes time. David Schnark talks about the average person at the age of 50 becoming known rather than validated, strong unconditional self-esteem. Maslow talks about the self-actualized person at the age of 45 or 50. That's unconditional self-esteem. It takes time. It's epigenetic. But the process itself, as we improve and grow, is or can be as enjoyable, as pleasurable as learning how to walk. I'll see you next week.